The air in the gym smelled of sweat and leather, and something older, grime polished by years of relentless punch after punch. Fluorescent lights flickered intermittently, the hum of a single overhead bulb slicing through the otherwise still and stale evening. Outside, the city had begun to soften into the dark silence of a weeknight, but inside this weathered space, on the edge of town, time did something different. It folded into itself. Dante wiped a sheen of sweat from his brow with the back of his forearm, the coarse cloth rough against his skin, the faint scar above his left eyebrow tingling in the damp heat. His amber eyes held a kind of fire, fierce and unyielding, but beneath that, something quieter slumbered, something guarded. The bags that hung like old ghosts from the ceiling bore the marks of countless battles, much like him. His fists had earned respect in this blue-collar town, where pride wasn't given but fought for, round after round, night after night. The gym had emptied hours ago. Dante liked it this way, early doors, late nights. The solitude thick enough to hear his own breath. The rhythm of his heart thumping, loud enough to drown out the world. It wasn't just about perfecting his stance or refining the jab. It was about fighting the silence that crowded in when people weren't watching. Fighting the fear, sometimes, that despite all his muscle and grit, he might still be alone. He punched the heavy bag again, slow and deliberate now. Every movement soaked in muscle memory and sweat-soaked will. A soft sound broke the cadence, not the heavy thud of gloves meeting leather, but the faint scrape of a mop against the dusty floor. Dante's breath stilled. The spacious front of the gym glimmered faintly under the cleaning lights. A figure stood there, no more than a silhouette, until the worn light caught the edge of tousled sandy blonde hair and the outline of broad shoulders. Elliot. He was closing up, moving quietly amid shadows and dust motes that danced in the uncertain light. The quiet gym assistant, a man whose stormy grey eyes held an ocean of thoughts no one asked to navigate. Their worlds couldn't have been more different. Dante, the fiercely proud fighter from a rough neighborhood where men prove their worth with clenched fists, and Elliot, the thoughtful assistant from a wealthier background where words and silences did most of the work. Dante threw another punch, then stepped back, sweat dripping onto the cracked floor, as Elliot came closer, holding a bottle of water like it was a small truce. "You want something to drink?" Elliot's voice was low, but steady, probing the quiet between them with reluctant kindness. Dante hesitated, pride warring with the tired thirst gnawing at his throat. Accepting kindness from Elliot felt strange, almost foreign. But tonight felt different. "Yeah," Dante said finally, voice rough as gravel, and reached out for the bottle. His fingers brushed against Elliot's hand, a flash of warmth that settled into something heavier inside. Elliot offered a small, uncertain smile. "I don't usually stick around this late." "Neither do I," Dante admitted, eyes catching the faint crease near Elliot's lips, the guarded look in those grey eyes that suggested a loneliness not unlike his own. They stood in the quiet hum of the gym, the night thick around them like a promise neither dared voice. "Funny," Dante finally said, "how we both ended up here, long after everyone else left. Like we get the place to ourselves." Elliot's gaze flickered away for a moment, then back. "Yeah. It's peaceful. Feels like the world slows." Cloak Dante nodded slowly. "Sometimes that's a kind of survival." They shared a breath, two halves teetering on the edge of something neither understood, but both craved. The silence wasn't empty. The unspoken weighed heavily between them, a thread woven through the twilight of the crumbling gym. Elliot moved to the corner where the old mop bucket sat. "I'm going to finish cleaning," he said, voice careful. "Don't want the boss yelling at me." Dante smiled, a slow curl of lips that softened the hard edges of his face. "You don't have to rush." For a heartbeat, their eyes met. Tentative bridge, spanning the gulf between their worlds. Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. The mop, scraped in rhythmic sweeps, an old refrain in the empty gym. The water sloshed faintly against the bucket's edge, echoing the subtle tempo, beating inside Dante's chest. He watched Elliot move with a quiet focus, the way his broad shoulders shifted under the gym shirt, muscles flexing beneath skin pale in the dim light. There was a deliberateness in his movements, a thoughtfulness that drew Dante's gaze like a magnet. After a few minutes, Dante set down his gloves and stepped toward Elliot. "Hey," he said, voice softer now, a spark of challenge flickering in his amber eyes. "You ever want to try?" Elliot paused mid-sweep, mop suspended between him and the floor. "Try what?" "Throw some punches," Dante said, turning toward the ring that sat empty in the corner. Ropes sagging out of shape, canvas scuffed from years of battle. Just spar light, nothing serious. Elliot swallowed, the stormy grey of his eyes clouding with something unreadable. "I don't know. I'm not much of a fighter." "Nobody's born a fighter," Dante said, stepping into the ring. "You just learn, and I'm right here." The invitation hung between them like a dare and a promise all at once. Elliot set the mop aside and followed, muscles tense but willing, as he climbed in. The canvas shifted underfoot, the gym's silent history pressing in around them. Dante wore a faint grin, hand extended in greeting. "Name's Dante." "Elliot," the other replied, grasping the handshake, the shock of contact sparking through both of them. They circled slowly, two men caught in a fragile dance, limbs testing the boundaries, the air crackling with unspoken words. Dante jabbed gently, teasing the space before Elliot, who raised his hands instinctively, awkward but eager. "Like this," Dante said, voice low. "Keep your guard up, stay loose." Elliot nodded, brow furrowed in concentration. His hands wavered uncertainly, then found rhythm, a tentative partner to Dante's steady pace. Their movements were careful, each punch and parry a step closer to something they hadn't dared name. Dante's breath came easier now, muscles uncoiling with the surprising comfort found in Elliot's tentative step forward. It wasn't just about training anymore, it was about breaking through the silence that settled thickly between them. "You're surprisingly good," Dante admitted, a flash of genuine surprise, one rare emotion that passed across his face. Elliot's lips twitched. "Thanks, you're patient." They moved in tandem, a slow build of trust and tension, a silent language spoken in gloves and footwork. Neither said it aloud, but beneath that dance of punches and blocks lingered a yearning neither dared face. The craving to be seen, understood, accepted. Dante's amber eyes locked on Elliot's stormy grey ones. "You understand me," he said, the words rough but true. Elliot blinked, heart speeding beneath the shock of the confession. "What?" His voice cracked like a thread breaking, barely more than a whisper. "You heard me," Dante said, breathless from the gentle exertion and something heavier. "More than anyone else ever did." Elliot's guard faltered for the first time, cracking the armor that laid bare an ache he had long buried beneath polished smiles and careful words. The gym around them faded, no longer an empty rundown building, but a crucible where their guarded walls began to melt away. "Yeah," Elliot said finally, voice low, hesitant but real. "I think I do." They stood inches apart, fists lowered, the air thick with something neither had been brave enough to say in the daylight. Something that carried the weight of years spent hiding and pretending. Outside, the night deepened, but inside the gym 2 worlds shifted, touched, and held the fragile promise of something new. Dante's grip on his glove slackened, the rough leather sliding a little in his sweaty palms as the silence stretched between them, thick with something unspoken, yet almost tangible. The hum of the flickering overhead lights was suddenly louder, the distant clatter of weights in the far corner, a faint tremor beneath the quiet air. He leaned back against the worn leather of a punching bag, the smell of sweat and dust mingling into something dark and familiar. "It's funny," Dante said, eyes fixed somewhere past Elliot's shoulder, How this place, this shithole gym, it's the only thing that didn't break me. His voice was low, rough, but steady. Like the worn timbers that held the roof up despite years of storms. Elliot watched him. The amber in Dante's eyes, seeming to burn brighter in the half-light, full of shadows that looked like memories just barely held at bay. "Tell me," he said, voice softer now, almost a silent question. Dante let out a breath, a slow exhale that seemed to carry the weight of many things left unspoken. "I didn't have it easy growing up, my family. Hell, I don't even know what that word really means." The faint scar above his left eyebrow twitched as he looked down at the scuffed gym floor, hands tugging idly at the ends of his torn hand wraps. "Everybody fights in my world. Not just in the ring, at home, on the streets, inside their own heads." There wasn't much room for softness, for kindness, his voice faltered, a crack slicing through the rough edges, for anything that made you feel human. Elliot swallowed, suddenly aware of the stoic facade Dante wore like armor, the way his words peeled back the layers to something raw and vulnerable beneath. The contrast threw the stormy grey eyes wide, and he found himself leaning in, as if proximity could somehow bridge the distance between the worlds they came from. "And the gym?" he prompted, voice barely above a whisper. Dante's gaze lifted, amber catching the glow of the single bare bulb overhead, focused and fierce. "This place, it's the one thing I could count on. Here, it didn't matter what my past was, what I'd lost or never had. The gym is rules, sweat, discipline. The ring don't care if you've been punched in your gut since you were a kid, or if the world treated you like you didn't even exist. Out here, if you want to survive, you fight, you listen, you learn, you get up every damn time you fall." He ran a hand through his close-cropped hair, thumb tracing the faint scar. "It's not just a gym. It's the closest thing I've got to home, to family." Elliot nodded slowly, his heart tightening a little at the image of a boy shaped by pain and hardship, finding solace in the fierce ritual of training, in the rhythm of swinging fists and measured breathing. He saw the pride buried deep beneath Dante's grit, pride in survival, in endurance, in refusing to be broken by a world that was set against him. That pride echoed in his own quiet struggles, though measured in different currency. "You don't have to say more," Elliot said gently. "I'm listening. I want to understand." The words hung in the charged space between them, and Dante allowed himself a moment to meet Elliot's gaze again, searching for something, acceptance maybe, or simply the courage to keep opening a door that had been locked tight for years. "I've always seen people like you, easy with your looks. Boy to damn smooth life, wondered what it's like not to be fighting, just to breathe, to not carry the scars beneath the skin. You've got your own battles though, don't you?" Elliot looked away, cheeks flushing in the dim light, hands balling into fists by his sides. "I guess I do, but it's different. I don't have to fight for survival the way you do. I'm not saying my life's perfect." He dragged a hand through the tousled, sandy blonde hair, voice a little gruffer than he intended. "Sometimes it feels like I'm wearing a mask so tight it might as well be skin. Like everyone expects this. This version of me, the one who's got everything, the one who should be happy. But inside it's like I'm a ghost in my own life." Dante studied him, sensing a tempest beneath the calm, a private war Elliot waged against the expectations and illusions of a world whose rules seemed alien and stifling. The gym's musty air, the steady beat of a timer somewhere down the hall, they grounded them both, two soldiers in different trenches but fighting the same war in silence. "What do you want then?" Dante asked, voice softer now, careful but curious. Elliot's eyes darkened, heavy with the weight of indecision and longing. "I don't know who I'm supposed to be," he admitted, the words raw and unpolished, more confession than explanation. "I built this image of success, of control, but it feels like I'm trapped under it. I wonder if I broke free, If I stopped pretending so well, would anyone still want to be around me, or would I just be nothing? His voice cracked at the end, a fragile thread that had been pinned under doubt for too long. There was a pause, a delicate moment where the night seemed to hold its breath, before Dante shifted on his feet, crossing the small space between them, but keeping a respectable distance. Sounds like you're fighting shadows. Like you're scared of what might happen if you drop the act. His gaze was steady, searching. I get that. Trust me. Elliot's lips parted, but no words came. Instead, he let the silence speak, a confession in itself. Dante's instincts tugged him backward, wary of exposing too much, afraid of the vulnerability that trembled on Elliot's edge. There were pieces of himself that he kept locked away, even in this moment of fragile connection. He'd grown up learning not to show weakness, because weakness meant pain, meant loss, meant survival was hanging by a thread. I don't know if I can be the guy who fixes things or even the guy who really understands, Dante admitted, voice low. But I'm here. Tonight, at least. We're both tired of the fight, maybe. That's enough. Elliot's stormy grey eyes met his with something quiet and surprising gratitude, relief, and something deeper he didn't dare name. Yeah, he whispered, it is enough. The tension in the room shifted again, a current that neither had planned but both needed. Dante thought about the battles that had brought him here. The bruises, the betrayals, the nights where hope was the one thing he almost lost. And now, here was Elliot, a stranger, with a different brand of pain, a secret ache that somehow felt familiar. Think about this, Dante said, voice almost a murmur. We're both fighters, just different rings. Maybe the trick isn't faking who we should be, but finding someone who gets why we fight that hard in the first place. Elliot glanced up, amber and grey, locked in a fragile truce in the shadows of the gym. He wanted to reach out, to cross the distance, and touch the scars he saw beneath the surface of the man standing in front of him, to reassure both of them that they didn't have to carry their pasts alone anymore. But the words caught in his throat. The fear of crossing a line, of being misunderstood, or worse, rejected. So instead, he nodded, the smallest gesture, but laden with meaning. A slow, uneven breath passed between them, the kind that comes after a sparring round, where neither wins and both walk away with bruises that ache long after the bell. But there was something else too, something fragile and new, like a thread tying two broken pieces together in the half-light. Dante's scarred jaw tightened, not in anger, but in the effort to hold himself steady. He wasn't used to this kind of connection, he wasn't used to feeling seen. But maybe tonight, just maybe, that was enough to keep fighting for. Elliot met his gaze again, the storm in his eyes clearing just a little, giving way to something softer, more real. Thanks for telling me, he said simply. Dante managed a small, almost imperceptible smile. Yeah, he said, and thanks for listening. The gym was no longer just a place of sweat and scars. In the quiet between words and punches, it had become something else. A sanctuary for two fighters, finding in each other a chance to breathe a little easier under the weight of their own shadows. The last fluorescent light flickered overhead as the gym settled into a heavy, quiet rhythm. The steady thump of Dante's mop pressed into the concrete floor echoed softly, a percussive metronome, to the silence. The air smelled of sweat, leather, and the faint, metallic tang of blood that clung to the worn-out bags and gloves, a scent-soaked testament to hours of work, struggle, and silent battles fought beneath these fluorescent battlements. Elliot stood nearby, picking up stray hand wraps and wiping down benches, stealing glances at Dante's furrowed brow, the way his jaw clenched when concentration took over. There was something about this late hour, when the world outside retreated and the gym closed itself off like a cocoon, that made the weight of their shared space more tangible. It wasn't just the physical effort of cleaning, it was the exhaustion of guarding their walls, the unspoken truths that crackled in the cold air between them. Dante's movements were deliberate, almost too deliberate, like he was testing the limits within himself. The mop swept across the floor, but his mind was elsewhere. Looped back to the half-spoken admissions, the ache of vulnerability barely touching the surface. The gentle scrape of Elliot's fingers, pulling at a stubborn stain on a weight rack, punctuated the quiet. Then, as if some invisible wall between them grew porous, one of Dante's mops slipped, the wet head catching on a crack in the floor and flipping up to spray a fine mist toward Elliot's shoes. The sudden splash drew a startled yelp from Elliot, his stormy grey eyes flashing with startled surprise. Dante's mouth twitched hard, but a laugh bubbled free before he could clamp it down. God, that sound, so rare, so unexpected, made something inside Elliot's chest loosen. Hey, that was not in the cleaning budget, Elliot shot back, mock stern with a playful grin. Now I need a change of shoes. Dante's shoulders shook as the tension broke immediately. Guess I'm as good at cleaning as I am at beating you in the ring. The words clattered out, rough-edged but genuine. His amber eyes flashed with an irrepressible spark, the guarded shield softening ever so slightly. Elliot's lips quirked up again, the weight of his usual reserve peeling away. Which is exactly why I'm sticking to lifting weights instead of dodging your sloppy mop moves, he teased, stepping closer to retrieve the dripping cloth. For the first time since the night began, the space between them shrank. Just barely an inch or two of hesitant breath and possibility. Neither one moved away when the other didn't. Instead, a strange, electric stillness hung tight around the gap, fragile and bracing. Dante's eyes flicked down, trailing the line where their shadows merged softly on the polished floor, before rising again to meet Elliot's. The world stilled, breath caught between heartbeats. Then, just as Dante's leaning in seemed inevitable, both men jerked back, a silent, mutual retreat. The air suddenly felt thick, charged with something unspoken, a boundary neither wanted to cross just yet, but could no longer deny existed. Dante swallowed against the sudden tightness in his throat. Asterisk. What the hell is this? The sensation was unfamiliar, tender and fierce all at once, buzzing beneath his skin like the sting of a punch that caught the breath. Shaking off the flutter, he turned away first, clearing his throat. You okay? He asked, voice rough but steady. Yeah, Elliot replied, voice low, steady but shaky in its own way. Just wasn't expecting a mop attack from the champion cleaner. A slow grin returned, a quiet tether in the stillness before both men resumed their cleaning. The intimacy of proximity hanging around them like a whispered secret. Asterisk. The quiet hum of the gym filled the spaces between their words, the night wrapping around them like a cloak. The weight of silence pressed heavier now, and yet neither rushed to break it. Instead, Dante let his mop rest against the wall, stepping over to lean back on the metal rack. His gaze was distant, eyes fixed on the scuffs and scratches marking the worn floor. I never liked being soft, Dante said, voice low, but steady, as if he was answering a question only he'd asked aloud. Boxing. It's everything. Not just the sport, it's my way out. It's my armor. His mouth twitched, struggling to find the right words. People look at you different when you're tough. When you can knock 'em down, they don't ask questions. They don't see the cracks. Elliot's eyes softened, the storm within them turning something vulnerable. I get that, he said, stepping closer so that the gap between them seemed less like a void, more like a space waiting to be filled. For me, it's always been the fear that if I show too much, people misunderstand me. Or worse, they'll decide I'm less than I am. He glanced away for a moment, the rough stubble on his chin catching the faint gym lights, a shadow blurred by unspoken doubts. I learned to keep my real self locked up. Even here, where I thought I was safe, Dante's amber eyes flickered to Elliot, an unfamiliar warmth spreading beneath his skin. For the first time tonight, the layers cracked openly, without armor or guile. "So what do we do?" His voice was quieter now, almost a whisper. "When the punches keep coming from the crowd, from ourselves? When we want to let down the walls, but don't know who'd catch us?" Elliot took a breath so deep it seemed to steady both of them. "We try," he said simply. "We try to be honest, even if it scares the hell out of us. Because maybe, just maybe, someone will understand." His voice trembled with everything he wanted to say, but hadn't yet found the courage for, until now, in the protective hollow of the gym at night. Dante met his gaze, searching the storm grey for that flicker of hope. "I don't think I've ever said that out loud before," he admitted. "That I'm afraid of breaking." The words trembled on his tongue, like an admission in the ring roar, exposed and trembling with the risk of defeat or unexpected victory. Elliot nodded slowly, stepping closer, the heat of their shared space pulsing beneath the surface. "Me too," he confessed. "I'm scared of being seen and not being enougher, being the wrong kind of Ina." His hands clenched and unclenched at his sides, an unconscious fight between pride and vulnerability. Dante's lips pressed into a thin line, the faint scar above his eyebrow pulling tight as if the skin itself echoed the strain of his heart. "For so long I told myself the ring was all I needed, that if I could control everything there, if I could punch hard enough, be tough enough, it would keep the rest of the world out. But it doesn't, does it?" Elliot's voice was softer now, laced with understanding. "Because the things we try to fight, they don't always stay outside." "No," Dante admitted, the usual defiance stripped away. "They get inside. They linger. Behind every punch, there's something I'm still fighting, not just the guy in front of me, but everything I can't undo." Elliot reached out, slowly, hesitating, his hand hovering near Dante's forearm. The gesture was cautious, reluctant to impose, but yearning to connect. When Dante didn't pull away, the hand settled lightly, the warmth of skin on skin, a slow, searing current. "I don't want to fight alone anymore," Dante confessed, the words tasting like a promise and a plea all at once. "With you here, maybe I don't have to." Elliot's grey eyes shimmered with unfiltered emotion, hope, fear, and something like acceptance rolled into one fragile moment. "You don't." They stood there, the gym around them fading into a hushed blur of shadow and light. Outside, the world continued its relentless pace, but in that space, in that moment, two broken men found an unspoken peace. Not in hardened fists or bruises, but in the quiet understanding that maybe, just maybe, no one had to fight their battles alone anymore. Dante swallowed hard, the lump in his throat growing heavy with feeling. "You understand me," he whispered, the words trembling with the weight of everything left unsaid. Elliot's fingers tightened their hold, a silent vow passed between them. "Yeah," he said softly, "I get it." And for the first time in a long while, it felt like something close to home. The gym's air was thick with the sharp scent of sweat and leather, heavy with the sound of fists thudding against gloves, and the sharp snap of elbows cutting through space. Dante's breath was ragged, chest heaving beneath the thin cotton of his shirt, every muscle buzzing with the aftershocks of their spar. The usual rhythm of their sessions had given way to something tense and unspoken, a storm pressing just beneath the surface. Elliot moved with that quiet power he always carried, measured, precise, like he was somehow always waiting, watching, calculating. But tonight, there was urgency in his stance, like every hit mattered more. Dante matched him, throwing counters and jabs sharper than before, the line between practice and something more fragile blurring. It wasn't just about training anymore, it was about everything. None of them had dared to say out loud. In the middle of an exchange flurry of punches, Dante stepped in too close, too fast. His forearm, raised in defense, caught the edge of Elliot's jaw, an accidental graze, a brush of skin on skin that stopped them both. Cold. Time fractured. As Elliot's brows lifted in surprise, eyes flickering with a sudden hesitation Dante hadn't seen before. It wasn't pain, exactly, not brutal or sharp, just there, a touch that carried a weight far heavier than a fight wound. Their gloves hung mid-air, hands frozen, with a residue of motion, shadows, caught in the dull overhead glow of the gym's harsh fluorescence. Neither spoke, neither moved. Dante's heart hammered wildly against his ribs, his lungs tightening as the silence stretched. And in that fragile pulse of stillness, the unspoken question hung between them, thicker than sweat, heavier than the sharp smell of leather. Was it something more? Was that brush meant to be accidental? Did Elliot feel it too? The line they had danced around for so long, invisible but undeniable, flickering beneath the surface, now raw and exposed. His pulse thrummed like a warning bell as Dante's amber eyes locked onto Elliot's stormy grey ones. The world blurred to shades of grey and faded colour. The gym, the distant clangs of effort and exhaustion, the distant hum of late-night traffic outside. Everything but that suspended heartbeat between them. Elliot's expression softened, a question mirrored in the crease of his brow, a frailty that even the hardest rounds couldn't bruise, a moment of vulnerability they had both, until now, fiercely guarded. Dante swallowed, his voice rough and almost trembling in the space between them. "You all right?" Elliot blinked, exhaling slowly, as if anchoring himself back to the present. "Yeah," he said, voice low and steady, but threaded with something Dante couldn't quite pinpoint. "Yeah, I'm fine." But the look in his eyes said otherwise. Said everything they both felt, but had never named. Dante reached up, fingers twitching as if to touch the spot where skin had met skin, then stopped himself, lowering his hand instead. "Sorry," he muttered, the word almost a whisper, weighed with more than just regret for the accidental graze. "No need," Elliot replied, glancing away for a moment before locking their gazes once more. "Doesn't mean it didn't mean something." That simple sentence sent a jolt through Dante's chest. A crack, splitting open old walls built from fear and denial. They stepped back, slowly breaking the tension, retreating to opposite corners as if the air itself had been shifted. But the weight of that moment lingered, imprinted on both of them like a fresh bruise beneath the skin, unseen but unmistakable. When the session finally slowed to a stop, they stood side by side, tired and breathless, sweat slick and raw. Dante dared a glance at Elliot, who was quietly wiping down gloves, jaw tight, eyes distant. The night outside the window pressed against the grimy glass, cold and indifferent. "I hate that I keep messing this up," Dante admitted quietly, not sure if he meant the session or everything else. Friendships, feelings, the mess inside his own head. "I don't want to hurt you or mess with whatever this is." Elliot looked up then, shoulders sagging just a fraction, as if surrendering to a truth neither had dared say. "You're not messing anything up." "Not with me, but maybe with me," Dante said, voice roughened by everything he was holding back. "I don't know how to do this. How to be honest about it, without breaking something." "No one teaches us," Elliot said softly, stepping closer, narrowing that distance with quiet determination. "We just have to figure it out, fuck-ups and all." The words settled between them like a fragile bridge. Neither sure if it would hold, but both ready to try. Later that night, Dante lay awake in the dim, suffocating quiet of his small apartment. The ceiling above felt too close, pressing down with the weight of all the things he wanted to say, but never knew how. Every breath seemed to stir the ghost of that afternoon's accidental touch, tender collision that had shaken something deep inside him. He turned onto his side, staring at the pale glow of the city lights, bleeding through cracked blinds, his mind racing in violent circles. The ghost of Elliot's simmering grey eyes haunted every corner of his thoughts, memory clicking like an old film reel through, moments that up until now he'd shoved into the dark. There was the softness in Elliot's glance after the fight, a pause that felt like an invitation, or maybe an apology for something the world refused to name. The way his fingers had clenched, not from frustration, but something more vulnerable, and how he'd told Dante, barely a whisper, that he wasn't alone anymore. Dante swallowed hard, heart hammered by a truth he could no longer deny. He craved more. Not just the sparring sessions or the tough camaraderie, but the raw, honest connection that Elliot offered, without judgment or expectation. He wanted to lay his walls down, show the parts he kept hidden behind a mask of stoicism and carefully controlled anger, to be seen, really seen, by someone who understood the fight he'd been waging most of all, the fight inside himself. But there was fear, too, the kind that lodged in his throat like a permanent knot and made him question everything. To admit it, to himself or to Elliot, was to risk everything he'd built, his reputation, his carefully curated identity, the certainty of being the straight fighter everyone presumed him to be. Was he ready for that kind of honesty? Could he survive the fallout? He rolled onto his back, eyes tracing the dark ceiling as memories burned fresh in his mind. The smash of fists against the bag, the quiet hum of the gym at night, the way Elliot's fingers had brushed his skin, trembling, hesitant but sure. He remembered the way Elliot had said, "You understand me." Those words a key unlocking something deep inside, a fragile hope that maybe, just maybe, there was room for more than the script he'd been following his whole life. The craving for truth gnawed at him, swallowing up the caution born of loneliness and scars. He wanted to reach out, to cross the line he'd been circling for months, to admit that this wasn't just friendship or simple longing, it was something raw, untamed, and terrifyingly real. Dante. The name crashed in his thoughts like a whisper from a deep place. His own voice, fragile and ragged in the dark. What if you're more than the story you tell yourself? His fingers twitched at his sides, an ache spreading through his chest, equal parts terror and yearning. The world outside carried on, cold, indifferent, but inside, something had shifted irrevocably. He wanted to talk to Elliot, to say everything he'd kept buried beneath bruises and silence, but the words wouldn't come yet. They faltered on the edge of confession, caught between fear and desire, waiting for the moment when the walls he'd built might finally fall away. And in that stillness, Dante realized he was tired of fighting alone. He closed his eyes, craving sleep, but knowing it would come only after he wrestled with the truth that he needed Elliot, not just as a partner in the ring, but as the man who saw him, understood him, and despite it all, didn't walk away. But the risk was terrifying, but the truth was clear. He was ready to fight for something more than just survival. He wanted to fight for a chance at something real, and that was worth all the bruises. The phone vibrated insistently against the nightstand, slicing through the darkness of Dante's small apartment, not with the usual rhythm of an expected text or a routine call, but with something urgent, somehow fragile. His breath caught in his throat before he even looked, a cautious tug of dread mixing with hope curling in his chest. When he finally did, the screen displayed Elliot's name, stark and unexpected. Dante hesitated. It was late. The gym closed hours ago. The night stretched endless and opaque beyond his window, and yet here was the call, a thread thrown across the distance between them, fingers trembling, not with fear, but something else. He swiped the answer. A gruff, almost reluctant "hey" slipped past his lips. Dante. Elliot's voice was rough, less sure than usual, small cracks showing through his usual guarded tone. "Aya, hey?" Pause. Like he was still dragging himself through words that didn't want to be said. "You busy?" "No, not really." Dante stared at the ceiling. Shadows spread across the walls like dark ink, smeared by the slow, steady pulse of streetlight filtering through the blinds. He could hear the faint static of the city hum outside his window. "What's up?" There was a breath. Then the faint sound of a chair scraping against concrete, the unmistakable creak of metal folding. It's been one of those nights, you know." The vulnerability wrapped in the confession. A rare offering from a man who built walls as much as fists. Lonely. Dante's chest tightened despite himself. "Yeah," he said softly, voice low. "I know what you mean." Silence thickened the line. Dante wondered if Elliot was still there, if he'd hung up, or just wasn't sure how to push forward. Then slowly, begrudgingly, the words came out. "I was thinking. Maybe you could come by the gym? I'm still here. Just staying late." The admission was small but colossal. An invitation to break the quiet loneliness that both of them carried, feathering edges, raw and uncharted. Dante swallowed the lump in his throat and nodded even though he knew Elliot couldn't see it. "Yeah. I'll be there," he said. "In a bit." The walk to the gym was a blur of cold city air against his skin, the night stillness pressed tight around him. He tried to steady his breathing, but every step hammered reminders of how small his world had shrunk, how much it hinged on this fragile connection with Elliot, the impossible gravity of feeling seen by someone else. Slow feral pulse beat along his ribs, both excitement and dread. What if he came and this was a mistake? What if the walls stayed up? Or worse, what if they tumbled and left him raw and exposed? The gym doors were unlocked, the usual echo of empty solitude waiting inside, like a sponge that soaked up every sound. Lamps cast low, scuffed glows over the worn mats and rusted equipment. And there, by the heavy bag, stood Elliot, his tousled blonde hair messier than usual, the broad shoulders slumped with exhaustion, eyes flickering toward the entrance as Dante stepped in. Dante's heart thudded harder than any round had made it hammer in his chest. Elliot's gaze didn't shy away like it sometimes did. Instead, it held fast, unblinking, a tornado of unspoken emotion spiraling behind those stormy grey eyes. "Hey!" Dante said, voice cracking imperceptibly. "Hey!" Elliot's voice was softer now, layered with something deeper tiredness. Relief, both? His lips quirked faintly, a crooked acknowledgement. They stood there, a fragile silence settling like mist between them. Neither moved to fill it, understanding too well how words could sometimes break what silence protected. The gym felt smaller, closer, wrapped around them like a cocoon. Dante's gaze drifted to the faint scars on Elliot's knuckles and the tired set of his jaw. There were so many things they weren't saying, but somehow this unspoken language, this tension, was the loudest conversation between them. "I didn't expect you'd actually come," Elliot finally muttered. Dante shrugged, though it felt clumsy in the quiet. "I wasn't planning on ignoring a call from you." They both laughed quietly. The sound was brittle but genuine, a fragile crack in the armor, each wore so carefully. Dante's fingers itched to reach out, to trace the lines of Elliot's face, to chase away whatever specters haunted those grey eyes. But he kept himself still, anchoring in the moment without rushing the fragile thread. Elliot's gaze dropped to the floor. "I don't do this. I don't do this kind of thing." His voice was steady, but contained a waver, as if admitting the truth already cost him something precious. "Saying I'm lonely. Asking for company." Dante's heart ached at the raw honesty. "It's okay," he whispered, surprising even himself. "You don't have to pretend." There was something vulnerable in the way Elliot glanced back up, like he couldn't quite believe the gentleness offered in return. "You're not like the others, you know. You get it. You understand me." The words hit Dante like a punch, harder than any in the ring, simple, unguarded, and true. He felt the walls he'd built around himself tremble, crumbling at the edges, drowning in the flood of Elliot's need. "I try," Dante said quietly. "I see you." They hovered there, suspended between truth and fear, and something unnameable. Then, Elliot took a small, tentative step closer, not close enough to touch, but close enough for the air between them to crackle with heat. Dante's pulse echoed in his ears, a fierce, trembling rhythm calling for courage. "No pressure," Elliot added quickly. "I'm just glad you're here." Dante nodded, though he barely dared to speak. The silence stretched again, but now it wasn't cold or heavy. It throbbed with possibility, a breath held deep inside the chest, waiting. Neither of them moved, neither needed to. It was enough. For now, the gym the next evening was steeped in the smell of sweat and old leather, the familiar clang of weights, and the low hum of fluorescent lights overhead. But tonight, the air felt charged with a new kind of tension, a quiet electrical current running beneath the surface. Both men arrived earlier than usual, as if drawn by a silent summons neither had named. Dante wiped his hands on his tank top and caught sight of Elliot already at the ring, shadowed by the muted light from a single corner lamp. Elliot's lean frame shifted in slow, deliberate stretches, the muscles beneath his shirt taut with rested promise. The scar from a late-night mishap on his cheek caught the glow, a pale slash that seemed to echo Dante's own faint mark above his brow. Two broken fighters in their own ways, circling danger that wasn't always physical. "Hey," Dante said quietly, stepping closer. Elliot's face turned toward him, eyes bright with a storm of emotions. "Hey!" Words felt weighty tonight, as if their usual rhythmic beat hid something deeper, something they both circled, but neither dared to name. Instead, they let minutes drift between punches thrown into the bag, hands wrapped around ropes, silent, but speaking in glances, in the small movements that carved space between them. Dante caught the haunted look behind Elliot's eyes when the louder noises of the gym hushed around them. He didn't ask questions. Words could shatter what trust was fragile and newly formed. Instead, he just stood there, an anchor in a tempest that neither of them wanted to face alone. Elliot's shoulders lowered just a fraction, the tension in his jaw thawing in the dim light. Without thinking, Dante took a slow step forward, nearly closing the gap, their breaths mingling in the charged space. The smell of sweat, leather, and musk wrapped them up in a silent confession, louder than any declaration. The gym's usual noises faded into white noise, a distant hum compared to the pounding of their hearts. "I don't know how to do this with you," Elliot admitted finally, voice low and rough. "But I want to try." Dante's chest tightened, a strange swell of something fierce and fragile at once. "Me too." For the first time, they didn't shy away. The air thickened with a hesitant electricity, an uncharted softness beneath the bruises and stubble and scars. It was in a way Elliot's hand twitched near Dante's arm without quite touching. In the catch of their breaths, when their eyes locked, in the fragile trust blooming, in the silence between words. "I hate feeling like this," Elliot confessed, voice tremulous. "Like I'm breaking my own rules. But if I'm honest, I don't want to stop." Dante's fingers curled at his sides, aching with longing. "Neither do I." They moved then, almost without thinking, just a shift, a step, a breath drawn in shallow and trembling. The distance between them shrank, until it was nothing more than a sliver of shared space, vibrating with need and fear and hope. Dante's hand found the curve of Elliot's arm, hesitant but steady. Elliot didn't pull away. Instead, his own hand hovered close, trembling like a star, ready to fall into orbit. A tidal wave of emotion rolled through them, uncertain, unguarded, but real. For a long moment, all that mattered was the gravity pulling them together, the slow, trembling dance of connection where words failed but hearts spoke loud and clear. "You understand me," Elliot whispered, voice raw with something like awe. "More than I ever thought someone could." Dante's reply was a breath, a touch, a promise wrapped in silence. "And I don't want to be alone anymore." The gym around them dissolved into shadows and light, their rough-edged selves surrounded by quiet. The fight was no longer against fists or fear, but something far harder: trust. And finally both of them were ready to step into the ring, not as enemies or strangers, but something imperfect and beautiful together. The night pressed in around them, a quiet weight that pooled in every shadow of the gym. The fluorescent lights buzzed faintly overhead, flickering against the cracked mirrors and dented lockers. The faint echo of a distant TV murmured, sports, late-night news, some background noise that barely penetrated the silence between Dante and Elliot. Their breaths rose in small clouds, condensation in the chilly air, their skin slicked from the sweat of the night's training, but untouched now by the rush of punches or speed bags. Dante remained standing still, chest heaving, muscles taut beneath his shirt. His amber eyes flicked briefly to Elliot's storm-grey gaze, absorbing the tremble there, the unspoken quake of vulnerability. His own pride, a hard armor, forged in years of fists and failure, gripped tight. It clenched at the edges of his throat, a silent warning, whispering not to let down the guard. Not yet, not here, not now. Elliot, who moments ago had risked breaking his carefully maintained walls by speech alone, now seemed to shrink into himself. His broad shoulders slumped a little, as if carrying some invisible weight heavier than any sparring opponent. He hadn't moved, still quiet. The fight inside him was unmistakable, the pull to reach out toward whatever this fragile thread between them was, and the desperate desire to retreat before that thread could snap. Neither spoke. Silence stretched between them, thick and draping, magnifying the sound of each breath. Dante's fingers clenched at his sides, knuckles going white from the tight curl, as the unvoiced question settled in the charged space between them. What the hell were they doing, and where could it possibly lead? Pride wasn't just a defense. It was a language as old as his bones, spoken in knuckles and bruises, whispered in the sweat and grit of every fight that had ever defined him. To admit what he was feeling, to drop the shield, even for a second, felt like tearing open a wound he was terrified might never heal. And yet when he looked at Elliot, with that cautious, almost pleading glance, the walls of that pride felt suddenly fragile, like they might crumble if only he dared let himself believe. Elliot's heart hammered fiercely beneath his ribs, a thunderous race drowning out the cautious logic he tried to cling to. This wasn't how he was supposed to feel. Not about this, not about Dante, not with this late-night weight of truth settling heavy in his chest. The world he'd built so carefully was splintering, every piece challenging him to look deeper, to be braver, to face a kind of intimacy that felt as terrifying as it was intoxicating. He caught his breath and forced his feet to move, stepping closer until the space between them was negligible. His mind screamed caution, danger, don't get attached, don't get hurt, but his body disobeyed, drawn forward by an impulse he couldn't quite name. Dante, he began, voice low enough to be more a murmur than a call, laced with an edge of vulnerability he hadn't allowed himself before. The word hung between them, heavy, a fragile invitation, and a challenge, all at once. Dante's jaw tightened, the familiar hardness returning. Yeah, I don't know what any of this means, Elliot admitted, voice faltering, like admitting a secret he had been battling alone for far too long. But I know. I don't want to run away from it. The admission seemed to linger in the air, shy and hesitant, as fragile as glass waiting to be shattered. In response, Dante felt something shift, quietly, a subtle loosening of tension beneath his ribs, where pride had held firm. There was buried beneath years of self-protection, a part of him that longed to be seen, understood beyond the gloves and the grind. And somehow seeing Elliot in this raw, unguarded moment, that longing felt suddenly real, dangerous, and utterly compelling. I don't know where it leads either, Dante whispered, his voice rough, lost somewhere deep in the cavernous quiet of the gym. But I'm tired. Tired of pretending, like I don't want this, like I don't need this. His confession was a thrum of vulnerability, stretched tight across the space between them, but carried in the earnest tilt of his head, in the flicker of his intense gaze searching Elliot's face for an answer. Elliot swallowed hard, his usual caution teetering on the edge. The restraint that had kept him at arm's length was crumbling, little by little, as though the simple act of standing here with Dante, in this unspoken understanding, was slowly rewriting all the rules he'd thought he knew. For a long minute, neither moved. Then, slowly, hesitantly, Elliot raised a hand, no, an invitation, and reached out to bridge the final distance, not with words, but with touch. His fingers hovered, trembling just over Dante's skin, the mere closeness, a rush of warmth and electricity. When his hand finally settled over Dante's, it was a feather-light brush, careful and fragile, as though both men were afraid that the slightest pressure would snap the fragile bond they had just forged. Dante froze. His breath caught and hung suspended as his body stiffened beneath the unexpectedness of that touch. The weight of it was so much more than skin against skin. It was a quiet admission, a verbal "I'm here," within the stillness. A temporary ceasefire between two men who so often fought alone, for an eternity that seemed to dissolve all the noise of the world outside the gym. Dante held still under Elliot's tentative hand. His amber eyes softened, the hard edges blurring into something vulnerable and unexpectedly tender. Slowly, let his fingers twitch, curling just enough to meet the light pressure of Elliot's palm. The gesture was small, a tentative return, but enough to make Elliot's throat tighten and a faint, hopeful spark light in his eyes. Neither spoke, neither pulled away. The silence between them settled, not heavy or cold, but warm, like a fragile bridge borne over the rushing torrent of their respective fears. It was unsteady, uncertain, but it was real. And in that honesty, an unspoken permission passed between them, to be seen, to be understood, to not be alone. Elliot swallowed the lump thickening his throat and let his fingers rest a little firmer, his breath leveling out as the walls inside him crumbled further. "I don't know if I'm ready to call this anything yet," he admitted quietly. "But, I want to try. I want to see where we can go." Dante's voice was low, rasping with a mix of hope and disbelief. "Yeah. Me too." He shifted his weight, the muscles in his arm moving beneath Elliot's touch as if answering to a long, unheard call. For the first time in a long time, Dante allowed a faint flicker of something like peace to stake a claim inside his chest. It was messy, it was uncertain, but it was something neither had expected, and both were desperate enough to hold on to. The chill in the gym faded around them, replaced by the quiet heat of connection sparking between two men who had spent too long keeping their truths locked away. No promises were made. Not yet. Just the steady pulse of hands touching and hearts opening. Stretched wide against the dark, far away from the bruised hands and empty rings that had defined them. Elliot's head tilted slightly, the faintest smile ghosting at the corner of his lips. A rare break in his usual guarded expression. "You understand me, Dante," he repeated softly, as if saying it one time wasn't enough. "Not just because of what I do in the ring, or the fights I fight, but because you see all the parts I don't show anyone. And maybe..." Dante's voice faltered, thick with unspoken thoughts. "Maybe you see me too, beyond what I'm supposed to be, beyond the pride and the scars I try to bury." The admission hung between them like a fragile promise, weighted and trembling in the quiet heat of the late-night gym. Elliot squeezed Dante's hand, once a steady pulse of reassurance, and something bolder beneath it. "I want to try to understand you," he said, voice steady despite the tremble beneath it. "Every part of you." Dante nodded slowly, a flicker of relief softening his amber gaze. "That's more than I ever dared ask for." Time slipped by, unnoticed. The hours, the sounds, the cold gym, with all its grit and ghosts, fell away like smoke into dawn's slow light. And here, in this fragile moment, wrapped in raw honesty, two men found a thread worth following, a fight not about winning or losing, but about truth, trust, and the courage to be seen. Neither knew where it would lead, and the uncertainty was terrifying. But beneath the weight of doubt, beneath the scars and hidden fears, a light had been kindled, a fragile, imperfect, unstoppable light. And in that quiet dawn of something new, hands still lightly entwined, Dante and Elliot took the first trembling step beyond the ring, into the messy, beautiful fight for each other. Dante's fingers never quite loosened from Elliot's, and the quiet swell of morning light sifted through the cracked windows like a slow confession. The gym smelled of sweat and leather, but somehow in that fragile half-glow, everything felt less harsh. Dante exhaled slowly, releasing something that had been coiled tight within him for as long as he could remember. "There've been nights," he began hesitantly, voice low, almost like sharing some secret nobody else could hear, "when I was in the ring but still felt completely alone. Like it didn't matter how many punches I threw or how many bruises I earned." His amber eyes flickered with something raw, pain, hidden behind his usual steadfastness. "It's like the fight was never really outside me, like the hardest thing I'm up against is still inside, locked away." Elliot's gaze didn't waver, and the muscles at his jaw moved subtly as he fought to keep his own emotions steady. "What kind of nights?" he asked softly. Leaning in just a fraction, the eagerness in his voice tempered with care, wanting to hold the space Dante was carefully unraveling. "After the crowd's gone, after the noise, sometimes the silence is worse than the punches," Dante said, his voice barely more than a whisper. "I'd be sitting there in the locker room, plastered up and bleeding, and everything I fought for would just feel like it was slipping through my fingers. Like the man I'm supposed to be, the one they want me to be, was just a mask, and underneath it there was nothing but a hole." His hands tightened around Elliot's, knuckles going white, and when he looked up, the scar above his left eyebrow caught the pale light, a physical mark that somehow mirrored the invisible marks he carried inside. Elliot's inhale was slow but full, like he was trying to draw that pain in and hold it gently, not so he could fix it because he couldn't, but so he could understand it, see it in the way Dante spoke. "I didn't know," he finally said, voice rough with emotion he'd been holding back. "I mean, every fight you've taken here, you always seemed untouchable, like nothing could break you." Dante gave a humorless chuckle that cracked the tension between them. "Untouchable doesn't mean unbreakable, just means you've learned to hide the breaks better. But you never hid anything. Not with me, anyway." He swallowed thickly, then met Elliot's stormy grey eyes with something nearly vulnerable. "You hear that? The quiet parts, the parts that don't get spoken? I've never had anyone hear me like that before." There was a weight in the air now, heavier than before, but not suffocating, a promise folded in the words that passed between them. Elliot's thumb brushed slow circles against the back of Dante's hand. Grounding and steady. "Maybe that's what this is," he said, voice steady. "Someone who hears you. All parts of you." For a long time, they sat like that, connected by something deeper than muscle or willpower, something neither had fully named, but both felt pulsing beneath the surface. The sun lifted higher, washing the gym in fruits of amber and dust, and with it came a sense of fragile hope. When the muted clang of the gym's closing bell finally echoed through the empty space, Elliot shifted, his gaze sharpening just enough to betray the hesitation in his next words. "You know," he began, fingers still intertwined with Dante's, "I'm scared." Dante's brow lifted ever so slightly, the scar twitching as if reacting to the admission. "Scared?" His voice was a rough echo, laced with curiosity and a tug of his own fears. Elliot exhaled, a shuddered breath, carrying the weight of uncertainty he'd been burying. "Yeah, scared I'm going to lose myself in this, losing the footing I have, who I am. Because this, he nodded slowly toward their joined hands, to the stillness between them, it feels like stepping into something unknown. Something I'm not sure I'm ready to fight for, but can't stop wanting either. Dante's eyes softened, understanding flickering behind the guarded exterior. I get that, he said quietly, the losing yourself part. But what if the real risk is what happens if you don't take the chance? What if you walk away from something that could save you, and instead, all you're left with is what you were scared to lose in the first place? There was a silence then, full of everything neither was ready to say. But it was a wordless exchange, so much more potent than any conversation could be. Elliot's grip tightened briefly, a silent affirming that he was listening, feeling, and maybe, just maybe thinking about stepping into the unknown with Dante. Outside the gym, the first whispers of dawn stretched wide across the horizon. The sky leveled out in dim blues and greys, and cool morning air swirled around them as they stepped through the door. The world beyond the ring, rough and uncertain, looked harsh beneath that pale light. But still, they stood close, neither moving quite away, their shadows mingling on the cracked pavement. Dante drew Elliot in slowly, a breath caught between them, hesitant but yearning. The embrace wasn't forceful or desperate, it was tentative and lingering. A fragile thread woven carefully, like delicate glass pressed into hands made for fighting. The heat of their bodies contradicted the chill of early morning, and for a moment the world narrowed down to just that, to just two men standing on the edge of something bigger than themselves. Elliot's arms wrapped around Dante's shoulders, heavy and warm, and Dante's head rested near the hollow of Elliot's neck, finding a strange and fleeting peace in the quiet rhythm of Elliot's steady breath. It was a promise without words, a fragile acknowledgement that what they were holding might break under the weight of a world too unkind, but also the courage to hold anyway, to protect this thread, no matter what came next. When they finally pulled away, neither rushed to step back. Their eyes met, and there was no need to speak the enormity of what had passed between them. It was written in every trembling breath, every unspoken plea, every faint smile that cracked past their careful walls. Hand in hand again, they stepped back inside the gym, the room now bright with the clarity of morning. The smells of old leather and sweat were no longer oppressive, but comforting, part of the space that had come to hold their fragile new connection. The heavy bags swung gently, the worn mats lay silent, and in that quiet stillness, everything felt possible. They had no map for what lay beyond that night, no certainty of victories or safe endings. But in the somehow sacred space between fights and fears, between shadows and whispered truths, Dante and Elliot found something that would carry them forward, a quiet strength born of being seen, of daring to be more than the warriors they'd always been. And as the gym lights cast long rays on their intertwined hands, neither moved to pull away. It was enough, this unspoken promise to face whatever came next. Together,